Well, good afternoon, everyone. Afternoon on the East Coast. Welcome to today's webinar on improving JHAs in electrical construction, a worker's perspective. I'm Chris Cain, Executive Director at CPWR, the Center for Construction Research and Training. Today, I'm joined by Babak Memarian. Dr. Memarian is the Director of Exposure Control Technologies Research here at CPWR. Also joining is Rivera, Safety Director of the Washington, D.C. chapter of the National Electrical Contractors Association. Thanks you both for joining. Before I hand it over to them to talk about the job hazard analysis and electrical work, I want to take a moment to go over a few housekeeping issues. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted on cpwr.com/webinars and shared in a follow-up email with everyone who registered for this event. The link is on this first slide here, and Jessica Bunting, our webinar host, will drop it in the chat in a minute along with the link to the PDF of the slides. If you don't see the chat box, you can open it by clicking on the chat bubble icon at the bottom right of your screen. If you are having any technical difficulties, you can reach out to Jessica there in the chat or in the email address on the first slide. And should you lose audio at any point, we recommend calling in using your phone. The instructions can be found through the WebEx panel. So all attendees are automatically muted for the duration of the event, but please, we'd love to hear questions from you. So at any time, you can type questions into the Q&A or in the chat box. And although we've already received a large number of questions in advance of the webinar, we will try to get to additional questions posted during this live event. And also, we'll keep track of them, and it'll help us inform how the topics for future webinars. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Babak to get started. Welcome, Babak. Take it away.
Thank you for the introduction, Chris. Hello, everybody. I'm Babak, Memarian, CPWR's Director of Exposure Control Technologies Research. Thanks for joining us. Before I start this webinar, I would like to acknowledge my colleagues at CPWR, the research team that we work together, Sarah Brooks, our industrial hygienist at CPWR, and Chris Lee, our solutions program director. So this is the result of a teamwork. So I'm presenting on behalf of our team. This project and this presentation is a part of our larger project Prevention Through Augmented Pre-Task Planning, which is funded by NIOSH. And in this project, our goal is to enhance the quality of job hazard analysis and pre-task planning in construction, specifically in electrical construction. But what we are going to cover in today's webinar, first, we will provide an overview and preliminary findings of the first phase of this study on job hazard analysis challenges and some strategies suggested by industry practitioners. And then we will move to high-risk electrical tasks and contributing work factors that we identified as the second step of this project. And again, this is from practitioner's perspective. And then the next step will be talking about human factors and human performance side of the process, and to see what information needs to be collected and how we should package and make them available to enhance the quality of pre-task planning and job hazard analysis in general in the construction industry and specifically in electrical. And then we will conclude this webinar with some sample ready for impact resources that we are developing based on the findings of this study. I should mention that we conduct this study in close collaboration with our industry partners, electrical contractors, unions and associations, and also general contractors that they have generously shared their resources with us, let us go to their job sites and collect data, and they have provided their expert feedback to better shape our research project and at some point readjust our research method. So as you see on this slide, here is the list of our industry partners, and I would like to thank them all once again. But why job hazard analysis, and why we focused on this topic, and why is it important? And I think it's more important these days. As research findings suggest, the majority of occupational incidents and injuries could be prevented if hazards were recognized and addressed properly and proactively. So by definition, job hazard analysis, or JHA, is the method or is the process aims to serve this goal. But does it really do it? So the first stage of our study was to examine this process from practitioners' perspective to see what gaps we could find in the process and where we need to focus more. So as I have listed a few of these findings on this slide, you will see that the majority of JHA content and documents are from compliance perspective. And unfortunately, there is minimal opportunity for workers' input. And we should emphasize that workers are the ones who perform the actual task. So it is very critical to learn from their perspective. And also lack of information on human performance and human factors that we will talk more in details today during this webinar. Lack of workers' engagement, and another important factor that practitioners raised was that lack of task-specific content and inconsistency between JHA content and task requirements. And why that happened? And as all we know, construction job sites are pretty dynamic, and the site condition may change constantly. So because of that, we should identify those changes and address them and communicate them on a regular basis with crews. But sometimes we see that doesn't happen, and we don't see a real consistency between task requirements and JHA content provided before the task starts. And also, we don't see any comprehensive guidelines to help contractors develop this process consistently. And because of that, some confusions and sometimes conflicts on job sites, especially when we have larger job sites and we have multiple contractors on the same job site. They might design and conduct their own JHA the way they want. So this can cause some conflicts and confusions. I have listed some of the challenges and strategies and solutions recommended by our industry partners during the first phase of this study. One important challenge which was raised by practitioners was long and wordy documents, long and wordy JHA documents, which can result in lack of buy-in and pencil whipping. And we hear this over and over from construction practitioners. But how can we fix that? Some recommendations are to replace text with some visual aids, like using photos and videos where possible. And also we can use manufacturers' catalogs or instructions to better communicate information with workers. So that can help reduce the amount of text on JHA forms and make it more user-friendly for workers. Another critical point that was raised by practitioners, and we heard a lot about it, is post-job review or debriefing after the shift is over. So we talk about pre-task planning or pre-task job hazard analysis, what hazards, and recognize some hazards and implement some controls. But as I said, job site conditions are pretty dynamic. So post-job review is very critical. And it is very important to have a debriefing sessions at the end of the shift and to talk to workers what changed during the shift, what worked versus what didn't work. So these are not mentioned during the pre-task. So we should communicate this. We should learn these directly from workers, document them, and communicate them with the rest of the crew to see what has changed and what adjustments we need to make to the work process to address these challenges. And sometimes we hear that contractors say, hey, we do the same task over and over. Do we need to do the JHA again? So it is kind of redundant. I would just disagree to some extent with this because the job site is not the same. If we think the task is the same, but job site may not be. And JHA is not only about our immediate tasks, and it should also address hazards posed by work crews working in our crew's proximity. So I would recommend that, hey, yes, we need to do that every day, maybe sometimes more than once a day. So these are important things that we have studied, we have documented, and um, we are planning to conduct another webinar, hopefully in fall, to talk and discuss these findings in more details. We have published these findings earlier this year, and I have provided the link to this article if you are interested in learning more about our findings in the meantime. And then CPWR will communicate and announce the next webinar that in that webinar, we will talk more about the solutions that some of the industry partners have come up with and they have implemented, and we can share those findings and to see if those solutions fit your company's needs. But let's see what we have in electrical, which is the main focus of this webinar. So I just wanted to give you an overview of the pre-task planning JHA and challenges that we have identified so far. But Jerry Rivera, Safety Director of the National Electrical Contractors Association of DC chapter, will talk more about electrical construction and tasks and requirements and the current status. Jerry has been one of our industry advisors, and he has provided a lot and then to help improve the quality of this study. So at this point, I would turn it over to Jerry to talk more about electrical construction. Jerry?
Thank you, Babak. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. My role was basically to connect the dots between the research team and the electrical contractors and the workforce, boots on the ground. So from that perspective, we were supported by many of the contractors, of which one of them, probably a couple of them, are here dialing today. Look, first things first, the electrical trade is a specialty trade. And it does have some high risk activities that need to be addressed. And the group of contractors got together, they highlighted a list of activities that were of concern that probably had more than just one hazard present, just besides the electrical. But as Babak has mentioned throughout the webinar, a lot of the JHAs are conducted from a compliance perspective. What does that mean? Historically, JHAs has been looked upon from a regulatory perspective, which means that people are looking to comply with OSHA regulations. Now, let's be clear, we all have to comply with the basic laws of the land. However, it did create a blinding spot for the safety and health efforts in construction because we weren't being able to see beyond that. So minimal worker input was a major factor. So what is needed? We needed more quality JHAs, more engaging. Look, trade people come into the trade because they like to work with their hands. So we were running into the situation where these JHAs kept getting longer and longer and longer, and yet we had miscommunication. I think the need moving forward is more to be able to gather in a more effective way the worker perspective throughout that process. So maybe we can envision that supervisor, that manager putting together a skeleton of what that task is and what he understands as hazards are, but we also have to give a venue for the workforce to be able to provide some light on that end. And what I mean by that is, look, as a safety and health practitioner, I see the world or the workplace differently than somebody who's doing the task. I see it differently than a supervisor. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think the whole idea of the project is to broaden the view and get beyond compliance and see the things that necessarily could provide could reduce the serious injuries and fatalities in the workplace. And if we continue to view it from a compliance perspective, we're totally blind to those efforts. So I think the need is clear, and a lot of the contractors that were involved have expressed the interest. And some of the things that they looked at initially, once again, 14 contractors came to fruition. and they identified the list that we see here below. They're not the only at-risk activities. This is just a sample of what's ongoing. And in these activities, we've also identified that it's not just electrical that's a concern. While in the electrical trade, we do have a primary focus on the electrical hazard, but there are other things that are emerging hazards that come into the task that might not just be electrical. And another thing that came up through one of the questions that were submitted prior to the webinar is, look, this applies to electrical and to those who might be working around the electrical work. And are there other trades that have more high risk activities? Absolutely. We're just starting from the electrical perspective because it's the group of constituents that we had at the time. But if you look at the list, look, some of the things that we see, demolition, and I'll go in depth into a couple of examples, but demolition, I think that could be assumed that, look, electrical secondary source of power being provided during the demo, the test equipment that we use for the verification of access of voltage, are they adequate enough? And then, of course, when somebody comes into contact with electricity in those tasks, are there other hazards that we need to be mindful, such as fall protection? And we'll go more in depth into some of these as we go into our next slide. For example, take a look at a task that does not sound conflictive in nature. If you think about it, pulling cable or pulling wire seems like a fairly simple task, at least on paper. But where those activities are occurring, whether it's in a manhole, in an attic, in a subfloor, in an electrical room. If you've ever been in an electrical room pulling wire for wire, these thick diameter wires, two individuals going through multiple bends, it becomes quickly apparent that this is a task that puts the worker at a serious disadvantage from an ergonomics perspective. So we do have mechanical aids that help us out during that process. However, the proper use. Tuggers are a mechanical means that we tie in, and it assists us in doing some pulls in higher gauge wire or when we have multiple bends in that particular system. But they do introduce with these new technologies some emerging hazards. What are some of those things? Pinch points, cables coming apart, because you tug too hard on them. Sharp edges, long distance adds another set of complications during those type of activities. So as you can see in this, the workforce provided input to say, look, I get we have all these resources, we have tuggers, and they're designed to make our life simpler in the working environment. But unfortunately, they introduce some emerging hazards. The beauty of this research that I told Babak and the team is that this is one of the very few times that we take the workforce perspective. And I think it's in the interview and process, we have historically known what safety and health practitioners want, what our customers want, but nobody's really asking their workforce. And I think the researchers in this project took the time to get out, boots on the ground, and ask these questions to the workforce on how they see it. Energized electrical equipment, I'm going to say from this perspective, not just when you're coming into contact with energized electrical equipment that you intend to or but there are circumstances that we de-energize certain things and we realize that they've been backfed. Look, in these times, there's redundant system after redundant system after redundant system that is offered for the reliability of our electrical systems. However, they do introduce an emerging hazard for the workforce that we need to be mindful of, especially when we're working in those proximities. Have we identified those circuits correctly? The one-line diagrams, are they correct? Are they accurate? Or are they complete? Do they reflect the total installation? Lockout tagout procedure. Look, this is one that has gotten more complex throughout the years because in the past, it used to be the electricians were the ones who were dealing with the lockout tagout plan. In today's working environment, that's not really the truth. I think we have more customers with hands on in the lockout tagout process, whether it's overseeing the process. I know there's different terminologies. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think just like we're talking about the JHAs, the worker perspective, it helps us understand how our customers view the lockout tagout process as well. But we have to be mindful that electricians are the ones that are going to be leading these efforts, and we need to make sure that we're listening to them along that process. In things that are emerging using conductive tools, I know we don't intend to do that. We normally lock and tag a lot of the equipment, but unfortunately with back feeds, proximity to energized lines, let me say this, sometimes you're working in a particular cell, and something that we discovered with the workforce is, hey, a circuit might be de-energized inside of that enclosure, but service feed might be coming in and providing some power. So while the power is off downstream, we are working while exposed within those cabinets. We wouldn't be able to see that, or it's not always obvious, right? For those of us who know, if we don't ask the workforce. What are the things that we discovered in these analysis? Look, we all call before you dig. The number varies by jurisdiction, but we know that when we call these, sometimes it's not a precise science. Oftentimes they tell you, hey, don't dig in 10 feet from this area to the left or to the right, and as soon as we move over, we hit something. And sometimes it's not as obvious. The workforce has an input in that aspect as well. Of course, emerging trends or emerging hazards that we're familiar with are the trench and excavation, but there are also other hazards that we don't think so because of the location. Again, worker input is critical. On the 7E document, we're starting to see more documentation on preventive maintenance. I think there's a general myth out there by the consumer, let's just say it that way. And we are all consumers, including in my home. When was the last time that I serviced my electrical system? I am kind of an oddball in that aspect because I work for the electrical contractors. I routinely try to exercise that, but most people don't. Electrical system has been installed. It provides power. It provides lighting. Then there must be nothing wrong with it. Unfortunately, we're continuously adding to those circuits as part of that. Overloading, those circuits. When you add additional circuits to it, it doesn't seem obvious when we're engaging in the task, but our workforce is able to see that as is going through. And one of those things about the workforce providing input is that I failed to mention at the beginning is, look, the JHAs cannot be written in stone. They must be a living document that, it evolves as the work progress evolves. The best rationale that I can, or example that I can give you is, if you look at the huddles during the football game, they're intended for one play. They do a huddle, they focus on one play, and they move on. And I think as we looking at the evolution of a lot of these JHAs in the future, I think that's what we really need to focus on. How do we take that JHA where we create a skeleton? Supervision does, because they have an understanding of the task, but then we allow the workforce to provide input and evolve that JHA so that their input is reflective during that consideration. So not necessarily that it's written in stone. There's enough space for us to adapt to that. Why? Because otherwise we wouldn't be able to see these. Again, contact with energized parts. I already said this before. Sometimes we think that because we turned off a piece of equipment, that everything's indeed off. But the workforce can give us some insight as far as telling us, and they have, look, yes, that is de-energized, but you see that little, window with the plexiglass, that's an energized bar. Does it provide sufficient protection for the workforce? And I'll get into that later on the actual questions and answers. It is an effective barrier, but we also need to be mindful that we are in the proximity of those energized parts. And of course, folks, look, we're trying to give you a blitz of information in this webinar, but for more details, you can look at the Professional Safety Journal to gather input on that peer-reviewed article that has gotten such great attention and has led us to this webinar. And I encourage everybody to, after the webinar, to do a read on it. But I'd like now to turn this over to my peer, Babak, to continue on with our feature webinar.
Thank you, Jerry, for the great information. So Jerry provided some nice findings and details on electrical tasks on some of them. So, and we see that what information is there in JHA, but what is not there. So as I said, let's think beyond just compliance and how we could do that. What else should be included in JHA, in electrical construction, as well as other trades? So what we are trying to do in this study, and as Jerry also emphasized, we are trying to learn and incorporate what workers say about the task. So we are learning or we are trying to learn from workers and to share this information with their peers and to share that across the industry. This project is also in line with NFPA 70E recommendations on human performance and workplace electrical safety. So we are trying to focus and identify things and factors beyond just technical part of the task. So we want to see how different aspects of the task can impact workers' performance, including their health and safety, like physical dimension of the task, mental. So these focus more on human performance and human factor side of the process, and what controls or what strategies should be employed to overcome some of these challenges, or how could we redesign the work process to redesign the task to simplify the task and the process to enhance and improve the overall performance. So this can have not only benefits for health and safety, but also for quality and productivity. Let's see what factors we are trying to address, how we are trying to bring these into practice. So let's suppose we have a worker on a job site, and besides the technical work factors that we briefly discussed earlier today, there are other factors that impact workers' performance, including environmental factors. One simple example is that when we have a project, let's say in July in Washington, D.C. area versus Phoenix, Arizona. So different geographical locations have different requirements and they dictate different challenges. So we are trying to learn those task characteristics that Jerry briefly discussed some of those. How organizational factors can impact workers' health and safety and overall performance, project attributes, where the project is located, what other challenges related to project itself, and also production practices that we employ, how they could impact workers' performance. But how can we learn this? The best way to learn this information is to learn directly from workers. Myself and my colleagues at CPWR, Sarah Brooks and Chris Lee, we go to the job sites. We conduct one-on-one interviews with workers and we ask questions on various aspects of the task, on physical load, mental load or mental challenges, time pressure, environmental factors. What makes workers frustrated? We try to learn these directly to get this first-hand information directly from workers. To date, we have conducted 90 interviews, in-person interviews on job sites with electrical workers. And the way we conduct these interviews is that we go to the job sites, we ask questions, and we ask workers to assess them from 1 to 10. We ask about their mental load. Someone may say, okay, it is 8 for me on this job. And then when they say 8, we try to ask what work factors or what other factors make that 8. And then they start sharing those examples or those factors with us. And we try to collect them and summarize them to share with other practitioners. And at the end, we try to ask them about tips and tricks. What suggestions workers do have to redesign the task or to better perform the task or make it easier. They do it every day, so they probably know better all the details about the task. As a result of these interviews, we have analyzed 18 electrical tasks. as I listed on this slide. But one note and an important note here is that to create more comprehensive information and understanding about challenges and requirements of each task, if we interview workers on one task, let's say overhead conduit installations on a building project, we try to repeat these interviews with workers who performed a similar task on a data center project, for instance, or on commercial building projects. So this way we can get some better understanding of challenges workers experience on different projects for some specific tasks. We are learning a lot from workers every day from any interview that we do with workers, but how we are making this information available and usable to our industry, information that we collect, and we have developed a template. We call them electrical task challenges and solutions. So these documents are categorized based on task and project type, and they contain challenges raised by workers for each specific task that we have studied. And for each condition that they have raised, we have pictures to help users better visualize the condition. So based on the comments that we have received from the industry, these documents not only good for job hazard analysis and pre-task planning, but for training, because it has some information, especially for people with, for electricians with less experience, or if they're new to the trade. So these documents that each serves like as a small case study give some heads up to workers that what they might encounter. For instance, if some companies are going to do some work on a data center project and it is their first time, so they can go and learn some potential challenges that they may encounter during that project. So these documents are easy to download in PDF and Word document, and users can customize them for their own needs. And on top of everything, besides the challenges that we have identified, we don't leave users there. We are providing also recommendations and some suggestions to overcome the situation. These can be some technology, innovation, or some very simple work practices suggested by our industry participants. So we are packaging these findings in a form of these templates and documents that they will be available soon through CPWR communications and research to practice challenges. And like any other resources developed by CPWR, they will be publicly available free of charge. But let's take a look at some examples and sample documents that we have developed and see how we are bringing this information into practice. As you see here, we have a document, or let's say a small case study for overhead conduit installations on a commercial building, which was a renovation building. We provide a very brief summary of the task, what the task was about and how it was performed, and some approximate location of the project. We don't specifically identify the location of the project in these documents. In the following pages, we have listed, for instance, in this case, tight space or tight workspace. Workers raised that as a major challenge. It is hard to work in tight spaces because this was a renovation project. And then we have identified some solutions. So this is the picture, this is the situation very briefly, and then users can go and learn about it. The next one is wire pulling. How could we overcome challenges associated with manual wire pulling? These are just examples. As I said, we have developed 33 of these documents, and we are developing more as we are learning more from workers, and as we are covering more electrical tasks. This is another example for mental load or frustration. So information retention is one of the challenging situations for workers when we have multiple sources, or if the project is complex. That is something that should be taken into the account, and some solutions or some recommendations should be provided to workers to help them overcome the challenges of this task. These are also other examples that we are working on, and they will be ready soon to share with the public. And we are developing a repository for all these tasks that we have studied and identified. And I would just emphasize that these documents and this study in general, we are trying to address some emerging hazards. As we learn these days, we hear a lot about mental health. What are the critical factors impacting workers' mental health, mental workload? These are some emerging hazards that these days we should learn and recognize and find some solutions for them. So with that, I would like to conclude this webinar at this point. Next step is to interview more workers, conduct more field studies, and we have some other contractors besides the existing industry partners that we are working with. They would like to participate in this study. We are in the process of planning and scheduling our following studies and interviews, to finalize these documents and make them available as soon as possible. And one important step is conducting workshops for both pre-task planning, how to improve pre-task planning in general for different trades, including electrical contractors, what solutions available, what strategies available for them to implement, and also for electrical contractors, especially for small and mid-sized contractors, to see how they could use this information to address some challenging situations they experience these days. If you are interested in participating in this project, or if you need more information about it, please feel free to reach out to myself. Here is my contact information at CPWR, and I would be glad to provide more information about it. Thank you so much for your time and joining us today. And if there's any question, we would be glad to answer.
Great, thanks, Babak. So we do have some questions that came in before, and then we'll try to get to the ones in the chat. So we're ready to get started. The first question is actually kind of a combination of two different questions that came in before the webinar that relate to the level of detail in a JHA. And how do you keep it short enough to be read before the start of each work shift, and not too long that participants, workers, and even management can tune it out, and also to make it meaningful but not overwhelming, that kind of thing. So what's the right balance, Babak?
Great question. As I briefly mentioned earlier during the webinar, some recommendations are to replace text with some visual aids. I think that makes JHA easier to understand, and plus it takes less time and it is more exciting, and it provides better learning opportunity for workers when we provide pictures to visualize the process and to show the steps. Some companies are using videos, short videos. That is another solution. And one very interesting approach that we will discuss in fall in more details is operational risk management, or ORM, that our industry partners at MC Dean, who are, I believe, in this audience today, they use whiteboarding process instead of paper copies or anything else. So it is very interactive, and everybody has the opportunity to participate. And I think the result is very promising. So that is another suggestion that I have. If Jerry has anything to add to that.
No, I think it's good. And the idea of these JHAs is to have fun with them. I think we're so focused on writing things down that we get lost in the interreaction of the human element. So Babak is correct. The pictures, the images, whiteboards, QR codes, those are all acceptable means. We just got to get away from, writing something down and saying, hey, this is written in stone, and there is no room for adjustment.
Great, thanks, Jerry. This question we're flagging for you. It's a question about best practices for a JHA when performing live electrical work. When a complete shutdown can't occur, like upgrades in healthcare settings or renovations in healthcare settings.
So let me say this, I wouldn't necessarily call them best practices. I like to call them industry practices. One of the requirements in NFPA 70 is to conduct a job briefing. I think we fill out the permit, we gather the information, but the job briefing is where the greatest opportunity is because it allows that supervisor to interact with the workforce to explain the reason why they're in that state that they have to work to do the work energized, and the other one is what are the effective means of remediation or controlling that risk. So that job briefing is really where the opportunity lies to be able to allow. And again, the job briefing is not for the lead individual to communicate, but it's intended to have that interaction that Babak is mentioning here. We relay what we've gathered and we get input from the workforce. The overall objective is for those members involved to say, hey, we agree that based on the evaluation of the task, if something goes wrong, we can all walk away from this one. So that's a industry practice that I think needs a little bit more improvement moving forward. And of course, it would be a missed opportunity if I didn't say we should always be looking at it from the perspective, how can we de-energize? That is the paradigm shift in the electrical industry. The question cannot be first, how do we work this energized, but indeed, how do we do this in a de-energized state?
Great, thanks, Jerry. This one I'm going to throw at Babak, and it's, do you have to do a JHA at every job site for a 3-person crew when the hazards are the same for every job site?
Very, very good question. Thanks for asking that. So, of course, as I mentioned earlier, I cannot say that the job site or the task is the same every day. As we discussed earlier, the job site is very dynamic. Even if our task is the same as yesterday, the job site may not be. The other crews may not be the same. So the JHA should also address the other crews or the hazards coming from other crews. So that's why it is very important to do it every day. Sometimes, again, maybe more than once a day. And then another important fact is, what if someone was absent on your crew yesterday and they show up today? So you need to repeat that information. So that's very important to do the JHA every day, no matter how big your crew is.
Great, thanks. This one's for Jerry. It's a little bit technical. So the question is, if a panel has a 480 volt and covered with plexus shield, can a person perform work on the low voltage 50 volts or less without being locked out?
You know, that is a good question, and I've given it that some thought because plexiglass is used inside of electrical equipment to isolate energized parts that are not turned on. For example, you have the main feeders coming through, and that have that small plexiglass barrier, and downstream everything is low voltage. Can you use that as an effective means to avoid people coming inadvertently in contact with it? I think that's what it's designed for. Would I use that as the sole means of consideration to tell people, hey, all gloves off and everything comes off? No. And I think that's what the JHA that Babak is talking about. This is where the workforce can add valuable input. While we think that the barrier serves a role, I don't think it's all encompassing. Keep in mind, just because it's 50 volts or under 50 volts, that doesn't mean that it's less dangerous. There are some unique hazards behind it. Is it AC? Is it DC? I don't want to mislead individuals. That is an effective means of barrier for that individual, but there are other considerations that I will keep alive before. I just don't want people to take my response as, okay, well, the barrier's there, we don't have to lock and tag out. No, I think we should do everything we can to ensure that we understand the hazard that people are working in place.
Great, thanks, Jerry. Next one I'm throwing up Babak, it's a question about debriefing. I think you talked a little bit about it, but the question is more along the lines of, should debriefing be like an absolute step in this process?
I would say definitely. Debriefing is a very critical step, and then it gives the opportunity first to workers to speak up if they notice anything during the shift, so they can raise it at the end, and that can be documented and should be documented and communicated with everybody the following day, and also to test what controls work versus what controls didn't work, or if they need to make any adjustments. So I would really like to emphasize the post-job review, and it is also recommended as it's as part of recommendations by NFPA 70E post-job review and debriefing. Yes.
Great, thank you. Jerry, this one's for you. How do you verify an electrician's certifications, and what qualifies an electrician to work qualifies an electrician to work on live panels or high voltage cabinets?
Yeah, look, there's some things that are in industry as a practice, licensing, experience, education, those are all there. But I would also guide what do you call this? The participants or the audience to refer to want to say it's Article 110 in NFPA 7E, and it talks about what a qualified person is able to do. So that section is actually Article 110.6 A1, and it defines what the qualified person is. I'll type that in the chat so you can look into it. And it does a better job at saying, instead of looking at a piece of paper, it actually tells you, can this person verify that equipment is indeed de-energized? Does the person understand the inherited hazards? That is more of a well-rounded definition in combination with licensing and education.
Great, thank you. And this one is one of the ones that came in before the webinar, and it's, I think, flagged for both of you. The premise is that JHAs were meant to be simple products developed in the field. Now they are required to practically have the entire safety manual listed on them or in them by the general contractors. They've lost the true intent with the workers. How can we get everyone back on the same page again?
So based on what we have learned from our participants and people who responded to similar questions, maybe having a regular all hands JHA across the job site, having everybody involved, practicing something like last planner and just having everybody on the same page. That would be something. But more importantly, at the general level, I think we still need some more comprehensive guidelines for everybody to follow. It is very subjective now. As I mentioned, each contractor designs and conducts JHA their own way. That creates some confusion and conflicts on the job site. But I would strongly recommend some methods like the ORM that I mentioned. That is a very simple and very effective process to bring everybody on the same page. It's more interactive and all trades can participate, and they can have it once a while with all trades on the project. So I cannot have a very specific answer to that, but these are just some recommendations, and I don't know if Jerry has anything else to add to that.
Babak, I think the football example about the huddle that I mentioned is relevant. We need to look at, there is a bigger picture, but we need to look at the small task, and that's what's relevant to the workforce in that moment. And that's what we've seen in the research that you guys have conducted. They're more receptive when they're seeing and executing at that time. So making them too complex kind of waters down the process. I actually like the ORM as well, because that's also a living document that the individual can update as we move along. And the notion that something is written and we got to stick to it, I struggle with that. I think we need to be able to adjust because our job sites are adjusting and evolving as we move along. But that's a great thought.
Great. Babak, this one, you had mentioned that you learned of a particular company using video pre-task planning. And someone wrote in with a question, and I guess maybe you could, if you have anything to add about what you've learned about video pre-task planning and how the firm that you talked about does it.
So as far as videos, they are they they are they are great things to replace text. And then some companies use short videos to demonstrate the task from the beginning to the end. So they can use it during the JHA or once a week, and to video and show the task, all the tools and material needs, or they will use during the task. So that is pretty much like a live demonstration, sometimes not really live, but they can see everything from the beginning to the end instead of just reading on a paper or having checklists or pre-populated template to read over. So this way, the crew supervisor or whoever leads the meeting, they can talk over the video so people can better connect with that. And also those videos can be provided in multiple languages, depending on the need on the job site, not necessarily in English. So they can provide translated version of that and they can use it. So short videos to show the task, the tools, the operation, yes, definitely. But it takes time. Sometimes people need to record them, or sometimes probably they need to explore other resources to see from manufacturers to get those videos and even pictures to use for their JHA.
Great. And now we have some questions that have come in during the webinar. One is really straightforward. Who should prepare JHAs?
Very great question. Historically, managers do that, and then we see that it needs some adjustment. And my suggestion, or personally, I think based on the findings of this study, JHA should be created by everybody on the crew. We need input from everyone, from crew members, from managers, sometimes from the owners. So multiple stakeholders might have different input for the JHA. So that is everybody's role. And back to that whiteboarding process, that gives a good answer to this question. Everybody in that process or similar processes, everybody has the opportunity to lead the meeting. So JHA is not going to be then just one person's responsibility. So one day the crew supervisor or foreman is leading the JHA conversation, and the other day another crew member has this opportunity. So to summarize that, I would say it is everybody's responsibility, and everybody should have a piece in it.
I have to agree with that, Babak, because that's really what got us in that corner, that we have given this task either to a manager or a supervisor or a foreman, and we say, you got to do it. And in some of the circumstances, I've also seen where they hand it off to an individual without any particular instructions, so last minute. I think you're right. Everybody has a role in the JHA. It needs to be more dynamic. Should the foreman or lead individual be the individual who puts up a skeleton? Sure, I think that's a good start. But he does not have to come up with all the solutions by engaging the workforce. You're broadening that view of what the emerging hazards might be on that task. So I would have to second that. It's everybody's responsibility. And if we tackle it that way, man, we'll be light years away on the improvement with this.
Just trying to go back to the pain with the questions in it. There's one here that I think is kind of specific, probably for Jerry. Will you discuss the topic of what constitutes a qualified electrical observer for site work? Ground preparation for underground electrical installations in a substation built in a 345 kilovolt live yard.
I'm gonna pass on that one.
Okay.
Reason being is I'd have to reference. I don't rely on my memory nowadays. But I'll pass on that one. But I will respond to it. If you send me it, I'll do a little bit more background research and send a adequate response.
Okay, well, I think Jessica can capture the question and who asked it, so we could get back to that person. This is a kind of a general question. Are there statistics available to indicate the use or absence of JHA in electrical accidents? Or do either you, Babak, or you, Jerry, have any experience after an accident happens, knowing what happened before regarding a JHA?
Well,
Oh,
yeah,
go
yeah,
ahead,
go
Pat.
ahead, Jerry.
No, so let me just get some clarity. So after the accident, reviewing the JHAs to see if everything was captured. Is that
Well,
the
the
summary?
question was really about statistics available to indicate the use or absence of JHAs in the case of an accident. I'm not aware of any data sources that would answer that question. So I was wondering if you could also potentially answer it from your experience.
Yeah, I haven't seen it myself to that level of detail. Not in a concerted effort or a research perspective, but if there's any research, I'm sure Babbitt will know about it, but I haven't personally seen it. It's a good idea though.
Yeah, that's a great question. But as far as the statistics, I don't have any answer. But during the interviews that we were conducting, we heard once or twice that people were talking about incidents occurred and the worker who was absent the day before was in that incident, and he or she did not get all the information needed. So we had some examples like this, but I don't have any accurate case or statistics to respond to this question, but we can investigate and see if there is anything in the literature.
Great. Thanks, Babak. Another question that's come in is, what's the difference between a JHA and a job briefing? How would you describe that?
Excellent question. Everybody's confused. And when we talk to people, we interviewed 23 managers and we are still talking to many more, and everybody is using different terms. Someone calls it pre-task planning, someone calls it job hazard analysis, someone calls it JSA, job safety analysis, AHA. But in short, I would say JHA is a smaller part of the whole pre-task planning process. In pre-task planning, we also consider production issues like providing resources, material, equipment, tools, everything from planning, scheduling, and logistics. And JHA is responsible for the health and safety part of it. But yes, I agree that it is quite confusing and it is very inconsistent terminology across the industry that people use.
Thank you, Babak. Jess, I wanted to flag another question from the same person regarding substation work, just that maybe we can follow up with afterwards with Jerry. Because I think that would be another one he'd have to look up and couldn't answer on the fly, or wouldn't wish to answer on the fly. And I've lost my place in here. Here's an interesting one. I ask my electricians to look around at the start of each day and point out what's going on around you. And my screen just moved.
Sorry, that was my fault.
Just, where was that question? Here, I found it. Don't do anything. I ask my electricians to look around at the start of each day and point out what's going on around you and that could hurt or potentially kill you. Everyone sees things differently, different levels of experience. Isn't it about situational awareness?
I'll jump in on this one. In just a thought process, and Babbitt can jump in. Look, I think the question is relevant because, again, going back to the basics, the problem is that we focus on meeting regulatory compliance, and it's not allowing individuals to go beyond that. There are things that can get you seriously injured that we don't consider. For example, if you're working, depending on the working environment, you're working in a trench and you're not mindful that it was an old gas station. I think we all kind of, at the job site, we think, yeah, we know that it was an old gas station, but we're doing this task and we're just so focused on, well, let's make sure that we, follow what OSHA says about trench excavation, that we miss that. To be honest, it sometimes missing the OSHA language is not the problem that can necessarily kill you. And there's a lot of examples about that. I've seen pictures where individuals are, cutting into concrete, and everybody's like, we all capture that image and say, well, he's exposed to silica. But then we look around further and we ask the workforce, there's moving vehicles. That piece of pipe is being held by a chain, which is being held by a piece of equipment. And when you look at those other activities, you say, wow, if that piece of mechanical equipment fails, that can really kill the person. Can silica kill them? Well, given the right time and exposure, I think it could create complications. But the immediate concern would be, hey, that piece of equipment can seriously injure that individual. So what I call it situational awareness, maybe, but I think the broader thing is to ask the individuals, look, don't think about any regulatory activity. What in this task do you think can get us seriously hurt that we're not looking? And that is looking around, literally. Babak?
Thanks, Jerry.
Yeah, and as far as situational awareness, I think, yes, that is important to give that understanding to everybody, every day. And one of the very great observations that we had with one of our industry partners, MC Dean, they were using a term called 720 awareness, which was really great and which was very fascinating concept, looking around what's going on around you, above and below. So when we ask workers to look around, we should make sure that we train them how to do it, how to recognize hazards and what is defined as hazard, not from our immediate task, but everything else. This was a very, very fascinating concept that they were using, 720 awareness.
Great. We've got a lot more questions. I'm going to ask one more question just to kind of wrap this up, since we have so many people still hanging in past the top of the hour. But this will be the final question. How much time should be taken for effective JHAs to be developed or created?
Well, I don't have any direct answer to that, to quantify that. It depends on a lot of things. Some crews might perform more sophisticated task or installation, so that probably needs more time, and sometimes they perform simple tasks, so with less complexity. Honestly, I don't have any clear answer to that, any accurate number to put on it.
Yeah,
Jerry?
yeah, and I'll say this: I don't. I think it'll be a missed opportunity if we focus on the time. I think the whole idea is that we capture, the hazards that are being identified in the mitigation strategies. So in some circumstances, like the Babak says, it could take 5 minutes, but I don't want to stunt innovation. I want people to look at this more from a perspective of, have we addressed all the concerns? And when we walk away from that huddle, do people, is this basic question answered? If something fails in this task, can we walk away? And if that's the answer, that, hey, we can walk away, then I think we've done a great job in capturing the concerns. But oftentimes we walk away from those huddles saying, hey, I don't know what was said, or I slept through half of it, and we need to do a better job at that.
Great. Thank you, Jerry. And thank you, Babak. This has been a great webinar. We really appreciate your work and you presenting it to the public like this. We will take a look through the other questions and see if we can get back to some of the questioners, but also use them to inform future webinars if we see trends and questions that we weren't able to get to. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone who joined us today. We still have a good number of people on the line, and we really appreciate your time. And thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.